Ryuji Chua is an animal activist and filmmaker who focuses on connecting humans with animals through social media content. He's made hundreds of videos exposing the plight of animals, but speaking up didn't come easy for him. In fact, when he first became vegan in 2015, he was so shy and socially awkward. He barely talked to anyone about animal rights, and when he did, it usually didn't go well. As a result, he vigorously studied communication, psychology, and personal growth in order to be effective and persuasive. And although he still has a lot to learn, today his videos have been seen over 9 million times. Earlier this year, he launched the Animal Advocate podcast, a show where he shares what he's learned so far about how to be an effective educational activist. So without further ado, please welcome Ryuji Chua.
Hello, how are you? I hope everyone is well. And I guess I just want to make sure that you hear me. So maybe if you could give me a quick thumbs up. I already did a check, so it should be good. But okay, great. So sounds like you can hear me, which is really great. So I'm going to share a presentation in a second. We're going to go back and forth between my face and the presentation, I guess. But let me just share my screen real quick. And bam. We're going to talk today about how to outreach without being pushy or awkward. So before we get started, Ellie, first of all, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. And thank you for putting this on, everyone on the team. This is amazing. And a quick introduction of who I am. So like Ellie said, I'm an animal activist. And maybe what's relevant for you to know for this workshop specifically is that I've done a lot of outreach as an activist, but like Ellie said, it really didn't come easy to me. I was that kid when I was in high school where I would basically, I was that kid who was never invited to parties. And when I was invited to parties, I would be super awkward there. I didn't know how to make friends. I didn't know how to talk to people. And for most of my life, just communicating with people in general was really hard. I had social anxiety. And even today, when I go to events, I still get pretty anxious about things. And that's why I had an obsession growing up about how to figure out how to communicate with people, how to talk to people in a way that I'd be able to share my ideas, share myself. And first, it started out with just my desire to make friends and be cool and popular and all that kind of things that you think about when you're a teenager. But later on, when I became an activist, I translated all that into how can I use these skills and how can I keep learning these communication skills in order to speak up for animals. So that's kind of my background. And so since I became an activist, I did a lot of outreach. I've spoken to, a lot of people about animal rights out in the streets in my day-to-day life, et cetera, et cetera. And through doing that, through reading books, through attending workshops, through reflecting, journaling, and all that, I was able to acquire some communication skills that have really helped me be able to communicate with people in a way that I'm confident and in a way that creates change, at least as much as I can tell. So that's basically who I am. And what we're going to talk about today is the foundations. So I put this picture of a foundation here in my presentation because when you think about any discipline, whether it be sports, whether it be arts, professionally right now, I'm a video producer and I make animations. What's really important to understand is always the foundations of your skills. So, for example, in my job, I'm an animator, and we have these things called the 12 principles of animation. And these are really basic principles that if you master just those things, you'll be so much greater at animation. And so, communication, in the same way, if you understand the founding blocks of what makes effective communication, you'll be able to communicate so much better. My goal here is really to do this. So, you know that expression, give someone an apple and it'll feed them for a day, but if you teach them how to plant an apple tree, they can eat for life, or something like that. I think that's how the expression goes. Well, that's what I want to try to do here. Because what I want to do is I want to give you some practical tips that you're going to be able to implement in your outreach straight away, but also hopefully after this workshop, you will have the knowledge, the motivation, and a framework to follow for the rest of your life so that you can keep getting better at outreach. We only have about an hour here together. So, of course, I want to tell you things and give you tips that are going to be useful. But also, I hope that this can kickstart the rest of your life in terms of how you're going to get better at communication and outreach in general. So, the first thing I want to address here is that outreach is a skill. So I put this image of a man riding a bicycle, a very vintage bicycle, I might add, because outreach is just like riding a bicycle. So if you think about riding a bike, for anyone who knows how to ride a bike, you weren't born knowing how to ride a bicycle. If you were, that's pretty cool. I certainly wasn't. So when I was born, I didn't know how to ride a bicycle. And when I first looked at a bicycle as a kid, I thought to myself, how does someone balance on that thing? It's only got two wheels. How do you balance? This doesn't even make sense. And when I first got on a bicycle, I couldn't do it. And in order to learn how to ride the bicycle, I had to train. I had to have someone teach me. I had to fall. I had to do all the things required to learn a new skill. I had training wheels at first. And so outreach is really no different. And I feel like sometimes with communication, we have this image that it's something that we're either good at or not good at. So many times I talk to people and they tell me something along the lines of, I wish I could talk to people like you did, or I could never do what you did. When I talk to people, I always get mad. I always get angry. And the undertone of that is almost something along the lines of, well, that's just how I am and that's how I'll always be, as though there's a inherent gap between people who know how to talk to people and people who don't know how to talk to people. But my experience is that that's simply not true because I've been there. I've been so awkward, and now I'm still awkward, but at least I'm a little better than I used to be, right? And it's something that I learned exactly in the same way as I once learned how to ride a bicycle. So how would you learn a skill? I want you to think in your head, the last time you learned something new, maybe you learned how to ride a bicycle. Maybe you learned how to play an instrument. Maybe you learned how to draw. Maybe you learned a new sport. What are the things that went into that? Well, if you think about it, I already talked about some of those things, but there are things like getting a coach. Someone teaches you how to do that. Maybe you take a class. Maybe you read some books. Maybe you watch some videos online. When you actually do the thing, well, you actually practice it. So if you're learning an instrument, you sit down at your instruments every day and you practice, and you just got to do that. And this is the exact same thing. So this image of someone falling off a bicycle is pretty much sums up how the process of learning outreach is going to be for you, especially if maybe right now you don't identify as someone who is particularly gifted or good at outreach. When you learn to ride the bicycle, you're going to fall. That's just part of it. Part of learning anything is that you're going to fail over and over and over and over again. And one of the things that we want to do is we want to reframe failure as learning experiences. See, because when you talk to people, and this has happened to me a lot, but I know this happens to other people because people have talked to me about this, is they talk to people about animal rights or veganism, and if a conversation, quote unquote, doesn't go well, they feel really discouraged because maybe they feel like they haven't done justice to the animals. They feel like they're a horrible person. They weren't able to do what they really wanted to do, which is speak up for animals. But what we got to do is, instead of thinking that way and having that be our default reaction to failing, falling off, we got to be like, okay, this is a learning experience for me. What can I learn from this? And the only way that you're going to have those lessons, that you're going to learn those things or fall off the bicycle, is you actually got to go out and do it. The only way to learn to ride a bike at the end of the day is you got to go do it. You can have someone talk to you about how to ride a bicycle. This is like this workshop where I'm talking to you about outreach. You can read books on how to ride a bicycle. You can watch videos on how to ride a bicycle. You can think about how to ride a bicycle. But if you don't actually get on a bicycle yourself and try to ride it and fall, you're never going to learn how to ride a bicycle. So outreach is the exact same thing. You have to actually go out and do it. So for me, the time that I saw myself be the best at outreach, whether it be at an activism event where it was specifically designed to do outreach in the streets, or in my day-to-day life where I'm talking to people who are around me, my Uber driver, someone who's sitting next to me on a train or on a plane or something like that. When I was the best at doing that is when I was actually doing it. I was thinking to myself this morning about this workshop, and I was like, the one downside I can see to me conducting this session today is that since this global pandemic hit, I have barely done any outreach. I like haven't really seriously done outreach, maybe in the past 8 months or something like that. And because of that, I know that if I go out to do outreach now, I'm going to be a little bit rusty. But that's my personal thing, and that's besides the point. But what's important here is that if you have this image in your head where you want to be the type of person who communicates effectively and confidently about animal rights, you want to be able to go to outreach events and talk to the public and have conversations with them that actually changes them. You want to be able to talk to people who you meet in your day-to-day life, or maybe your friends and family. Well, you're going to have to practice this. There's no way around it. Or I don't know a way around it. If you know a way around it, that's pretty cool, but I don't think there's a way around it. It's exactly the same thing as pretty much riding a bicycle. To illustrate this, I just want to tell you a quick story of my first time doing outreach, because it was a disaster. So essentially, my first time doing outreach was at a street activism event. It was a few weeks after I started being an activist, so to speak. I had been a quiet vegan for 2.5 years, always wanted to do something about it. But ironically, the reason that as a vegan, I didn't put myself out there was because I was scared of what people would think of me. I was scared to talk to my friends and family. I was scared to talk to strangers. I would never want to do that. And when people asked me if I was vegan, I almost try to hide it. Like I would say things like, I'm trying out this vegan thing. I know it's just a thing I'm trying out, just because I was so scared to talk to people. But I really wanted to. And so finally, 2.5 years later, I put myself out there and I was like, I'm doing this. But the first time I was out in the streets, and it was one of those events where you hold screens that show what happens to the animals and then people talk to people. Well, what I did is I was so terrified to talk to anyone that for the entire, I think the event was 4 hours or something. For the whole 4 hours, I just held a screen. I was actually so socially anxious that I was too self-conscious to ask someone to swap me out. Like I got really tired holding the screen, but I was just like, this is going to be awkward if I asked them to swap me out. So I just stood there for 4 hours, just holding the screen. And after that, it was when we were packing up. The event was packing up. I gave my screen back to the organizers, and I saw someone standing there, and I was like, you know what? This is my time to shine. I'm gonna do this. And so I go up to them, and I'm like, hey, so do you know what we're doing here? And it was incredibly awkward, because what happened afterwards is that basically that person kind of said a few words back. I think they had an excuse or something like that. You know, some was classic things. And I immediately froze up. I had no idea what to say. I went silent. And what ended up happening is that someone else came in and kind of took over the conversation for me. And I just kind of walked away looking at the floor, just like sad. It was bad. It was really awkward. So that was me, my first time doing outreach. So if I can get someone competent in outreach, then so can you, I guess what I would say. And the final analogy I want to give on this, it's like climbing a mountain. So this is a picture of Mount Fuji right here. And a few years ago, me and a friend of mine decided to hike up Mount Fuji. And I remember this time we were at the bottom. We were in a village that was not at the base of Mount Fuji, but it was like we were at the village. Then in front of us there was the forest, and then there was Mount Fuji. And we looked at the mountain; it seemed so big, and we were thinking to ourselves, we're gonna walk up this thing. Like, how are we ever gonna do that? It seems so high up. But what we did is we started walking step by step, step by step, and a few days later, we made it to the top. And this is the same thing. You're not going to get good at outreach overnight. You're not going to be able to be confident overnight, or you're going to have awkward conversations while you're learning. But if you think to yourself, okay, this is a lifelong journey, and every day I'm going to take steps towards becoming the outstanding communicator that I want to be, then one day you will be there. Well, it's not like there's a destination. It's really a lifelong journey. So you just kind of keep walking forever, but you will be surprisingly ahead of where you think you could ever be. So now what I want to talk to you about is probably what you're excited for, what I'm super excited for as well. I want to talk to you about the 3 most important lessons I learned about how to do outreach effectively. And these, like I said, are foundational elements, tools of effective communication. And now there are a lot of things I could talk about, but I just wanted to talk about those 3 so that maybe you can take away 1 or 2, or maybe all 3, and then actually go implement those things. Because I don't just want to inspire you or motivate you today, but I really hope to give you some practical tips that you can implement and give you ideas and tools that you can actually use in your life. That's the entire point, right? So, number 1 is don't be this guy. So, I don't know if anyone knows who this person is. I should have looked it up before, but I didn't. All you got to know is that this person is a philosopher. And I say, don't be this guy because I feel like, in my experience, when I've spoken to a lot of people and how they talk about animal rights with people, they have a very philosophical approach to the topic. So, what do I mean by this? Let me just give an example. Have you ever heard someone say this? Oh, that's great at all. I love what you're doing. I think animal rights is very important. And vegans, I respect your choice to be vegan, but did you know that plants feel pain too? It's probably something that we have all heard before. I've heard it a million times. You've heard it a million times. It's like, I don't know, where were these plants rights activists before I was vegan? I didn't know they existed, but now they're a thing, apparently. So, you know what? We're going to deal with them. Well, if you think about this question, what is the answer that you would give to this? Overwhelmingly, the answer that I hear from vegans and animal rights activists is, well, plants don't feel pain because they don't have a brain or a central nervous system. But even if plants did feel pain, it would still be better to be vegan because more plants are killed in animal agriculture than in plant agriculture. So therefore, if you believe that plants feel pain, you should be vegan. Now, what is the problem with answering like this? The problem, in my experience, is that it just doesn't work. Like, I have never had it where someone says plants feel pain, I say that, and they're like, you know what? You are right. I was wrong. I take it back. I'm now vegan. I never thought of it like that. That makes sense. It's just never happened. And the reason why is because the answer I just gave to that objection, quote unquote, is a philosophical answer. It's a logical answer to the question. And the problem with this is that we're just not logical. As much as we like to think that we think rationally, we are emotional and not logical. The way that we make decisions is we make decisions emotionally. I think I saw someone said Socrates in the chat. Was that person Socrates? I should know that. I don't know that. So I don't know. But the thing I want you to get out of this is this right here. Use philosophy to understand animal rights, but use psychology to talk about it. Because philosophy is extremely useful in understanding things. I love philosophy. I think it's super cool. I love thinking about things logically and rationally and understanding why things are ethical, unethical. I don't know. I'm a nerd like that. I like that type of thing. But when it comes to communicating with people, overwhelmingly, what I found to be more important is psychology. So one thing that I've had people say to me is, I would love to get out there and talk to people about animal rights, but I just feel like I don't know enough. I feel like I don't have enough knowledge. I feel like I should learn all the different facts and the figures and the statistics. And in my experience, I don't believe that to be true at all, because in my about 2 years of doing outreach, I have almost never brought up all those complicated facts and figures and statistics and things like that, maybe here and there. But the amount of philosophical knowledge that I use in my outreach is extremely small compared to the amounts of psychological knowledge that I use. What has been much more useful to me in real life is understanding things like, how do humans make decisions? what influences people? How, like when people make decisions, what kind of psychological processes go on in their heads that drive them to make the decisions that they make? Understanding those kinds of things have been much more useful to me than knowing how many more plants die in plant agriculture, in animal agriculture than in plant agriculture. That is not helps me, because even if I knew that, it would just never serve to actually persuade someone. So the question that we want to answer here is, why are people vegan? And if you think about the philosophical approach, the assumption is that people become vegan, or people become an ally to the animals, they become an animal rights activist, because they logically understand that that is the ethical thing to do. They logically understand that there's no way to justify what humans do to animals, and therefore they change. Well, if you've been an animal rights activist for any length of time, you will know that this is just not how it is. You can't just tell people the facts and they change. It just, I don't know. It just doesn't happen. So, of course, for some people, it's going to be the case. And some people are very logical and you tell them the facts and then they change. But for a lot of people, that's not the case. And the way that I like to think about it is this: when people actually change is when they're emotionally compelled to do so. And the way that you can think about it is, the way that we make decisions is generally we do what emotionally fulfills us the most. And people have different worldviews, which is why we make different decisions. But in the case of, let's take the example of becoming vegan. In my experience, talking to all the vegans that I know and talking to people who are not vegan, people change when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of changing. So there are two opposing forces at play here. On one hand, when you talk to people and they say things like, I think animal rights is really important, but I just like burgers too much. What's happening is that in their bodies, what they're feeling like is they're two conflicting things. On one hand, they're like, the information that you're presenting me with is making me feel bad. I hate seeing animals suffer like this. I hate thinking about this. It makes me feel uncomfortable. And on the other side, there's the thought of, well, if I change, I'm never going to eat a burger again. That just feels terrible. I can't even imagine my life without that. And what happens is that that's perceived pain of going their entire lives without eating another burger or steak seems disproportionately bigger than the pain of, oh, this makes me feel kind of guilty, but I can deal with it. People say, I can still sleep at night. Well, that's because it doesn't make them feel that bad. It doesn't eat them alive to just live with this hypocrisy. It feels much more painful to actually change. So therefore, they don't change. And I would challenge you to think about your own experience of becoming an animal rights activist. If you are vegan, then why did you become vegan? Well, probably, if you think back emotionally, you just couldn't live with yourself knowing that if you weren't vegan, you were contributing to animal exploitation, to animal abuse, to the destruction of the environment, or there was something there where you were like, I can't do this anymore. And in comparison, changing was like, well, okay, it might be a little bit uncomfortable, maybe not, but it seems so much more reasonable, so much easier to change than it would be to live with this. Like for me, I know that when I became vegan, I couldn't live with myself if I kept consuming animal products and I kept contributing to a system that exploits, abuses, and kills animals by the billions. I couldn't do it. And I would argue that even for those people who are extremely logical, because I myself generally, I think as myself as a very logical person, I'm much more logical than emotional. Well, if I think about the way that I make logical decisions, the reason, if you present me with facts that show me that I'm wrong about something, I'm going to change. But the reason why is not because I'm logical and I'm so great. It's because emotionally, for me, living in a way that is not logical, living in a way that's not morally consistent, is something that I can't emotionally deal with. If you point out how I'm a hypocrite, Like, I understand it logically, but emotionally, the idea of being a hypocrite, it eats me alive. I can't deal with it. And I would rather change. That's much less painful. And so even though I would love to think that I'm a very logical person who makes decisions logically, I do believe that I'm still a human being and I still make decisions emotionally. And that's just how we are. I mean, if humans were actually logical, our world would be in pretty good shape right now. But, unfortunately, um, that's not the case. So to illustrate this, I want to share a story with you of this one time I was talking to someone. I was talking to someone on an Instagram live stream one time, and she was basically on the brink of becoming vegan. And she was at that exact stage where she knew what was happening to animals. She knew how bad it was. She wanted to transition to becoming a vegan, but she just couldn't do it. And here, there are a few ways that you could approach a conversation when you're in this type of situation, right? So this is a very specific situation where someone's like, you know, I know I should do it, but I don't know. I can't do it. Well, one approach would have been to try to focus on what she can do in order to change. Be like, well, just stop. Like, just stop buying the cheese and just buy this instead. The problem with that is that it doesn't get to the core emotional conflict that keeps that person there in that moment. So what I did in that conversation is I spent a huge amount of time digging into how she would feel if she stayed the same. So I asked questions like, well, if you stay, what is it going to cost if you don't change? If you keep living the life that you live, even though it's comfortable, what is it going to cost? And I got her to acknowledge that, well, say I eat dairy products 3 times a week, is going to cause suffering to this number of cows. I mean, it's not exact math, but she herself came to the conclusion that, wow, like she never really thought about it, but all of a sudden she was like, if I don't change, that means that over a year, I'm going to cause this much suffering. And she actually put a number on it. And I really had to reflect on how they would make her feel knowing that this is what it's going to be like. In contrast, I asked her, well, if you decide to change, what is it going to cost then? Well, I don't know. It's going to be hard for like 2 weeks. Okay. How does that feel in comparison to the feeling you get when you think about the long-term consequences of your actions? And what she found was that pain of changing was so much less. And after that, we actually messaged a few times back and forth where she did become vegan. I haven't spoken to her in a long time, but I'm pretty sure that she has stuck with it. And what's so great with that is, not just the fact that she has done what I want her to do and what's best for the animals, but I think it's so cool because she did what she wanted to do. Because fundamentally, I think that a lot of people want to do what's best, but it's very difficult for them to put themselves in that position and to really confront themselves and to really think about the long-term consequences of their actions and think about how they feel and stuff like that. So I was able to help her do that. Now, as a quick side note, if you're interested in hearing this conversation, I actually recorded it and it's on an unlisted video on my YouTube channel. So if you want to see that conversation, you can email me after this at peacebyvegan@gmail.com or find a way to message me, or maybe you can contact the organizers. I don't know how we're going to do it, but if anyone's interested in hearing that conversation, I can actually send it to you, where we go from, she's vegetarian at first, and then all the way at the end, she's like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to change because I got no choice now. So let me know if you're interested. But that story, I think, perfectly illustrates how we make decisions emotionally. And if you understand that, you have a shot at communicating with people in a very effective way. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is the concept of listening. As animal rights activists, we want to be heard. We want the message to listen to us. That's what I've always wanted, I know. And oftentimes, when you want to be heard, your first instincts, or my first instincts, would have been to just tell people. I'm like, I just want to scream. I just want to tell people, you just got to know. Just sit down, listen to what I have to say, because I have something really important. I know that what I have to say is more important than what you have to say. Therefore, you should listen to me. The problem with this is that, in my experience, it just never works. when I talk to people and I just want them to listen to me, but I haven't done a good job of listening to them first, they really want to listen to me. And the way that you can think about it is this. If you've ever been in a situation where you really wanted to tell something to someone, say it's a animal rights message, you really want to tell someone, well, in that moment, what goes on in your head? For me, what goes on is I just think to myself, I want you to know this information. I want to say this right now. I want to say this right now. This is what's in my head. I want to say this. And what happens is that even though I'm not conscious of it, if someone else is talking to me, I'm not really going to be intensely listening to what they say. If I just met them, I'm going to forget their name. I'm not going to know what they're talking about, what they're telling me, because in my head, I'm just so caught up in this is what I want to say. And you can notice this in group settings. If you ever hang out with friends and you are in a group setting and you observe how people talk to each other and how people communicate with each other, what you'll find is that a lot of times people just kind of talk about what they want to talk about, and you can tell that that's what's on their mind. So have you ever been in a conversation where you tell a story or you say something and maybe it's something awesome that happened to you, maybe it's a tragic story or something like that, and then someone else in the group, just after you finish the story, they're like, just tell their own story, or they say something like, that reminds me of when I was a kid, this happened to me, or like the other day this happened to me, and they just launch straight into their thing and you feel really not heard. Well, what's happening is that that person is just thinking in their heads while you're talking, they're like, well, this is what I want to say. Because generally, the types of thoughts that people have, including myself, when we talk to people, is things like, how does this relate to me? What do I have to say about this? We just think about ourselves. And so when you want to apply this in outreach, the important thing to understand is that if you want to be heard, you want to listen first. I found this to be super helpful once I realized that, okay, I as much as I think this is so urgent, what I'm talking about, I want to talk about it right now. If I spend some time actually getting to know the person in front of me, actually listening, it's going to help me in the long term, or in the long term in this conversation. It's really going to help. So the best way I could put this to you is tell you a story, or multiple stories of when I used to talk to my Uber drivers. So about a couple years ago, I used to work for a sanctuary called Rowdy Girl Sanctuary. And at the time, they were located in Angleton, Texas. And what would happen is that when I would go there, I would have to take a Uber or taxi over to the sanctuary because they were too busy to come pick me up and there's no public transports. And the ride was about 40 minutes each time, 40 minutes to an hour. And so what I would do is every time I would challenge myself to have an outreach conversation with the driver, because I was like, I have 40 minutes. I'm going to spend 40 minutes with this person. Might as well talk to them about animal rights. What else am I going to do? There's nothing else I want to do. And the first few times it was really difficult because like I said, I have social anxiety. So to me, even thinking about that is overwhelming. So maybe you've been in a situation where you're like, I want to talk about animal rights, but it's emotionally overwhelming because you think to yourself, this is going to go bad. It's going to be awkward. Maybe they don't want to hear about it. Maybe they don't like me. You have all these thoughts, right? So that used to be me. But at a certain point, I decided to switch my approach. And I was like, you know what? Instead of going into the conversation, putting the pressure on myself from the get-go to be like, I am going to talk about animal rights straight away. I was like, let me just spend some time getting to know this person. So I would sit in the car, and as we would drive off, I would start talking to them and asking questions about them. So I'd start off with things like, how long have you been doing this job? Oh, do you enjoy it? Do you have any wild stories of customers? Haha, I guess that's a very cliche question that everyone asks you. Do you have any hobbies? What are you passionate about? And more, I would get to know this person. And every time they would reveal information, I would go on and ask further questions about them. And so what happens very often is that I would get to know them and I would start to know things about their hobbies, their family. Sometimes they would tell me about their struggles, what they're really passionate about, all these different types of things. And this would go on for maybe 15 to 20 minutes where I would just ask them questions and they would just tell me about themselves. And the whole time I would sit there and listen. And this served two purposes. The first purpose, like I said, is that I am listening to them first. When people feel heard and appreciated, they're much more open to hearing you and listening to you because they're like, well, You listen to me, so I'm going to listen to you. It's reciprocation. We like to reciprocate things that have been given to us. That's why if someone does you a favor and then they ask you for a favor back, you feel guilty to say no, because as humans, we just feel the need to reciprocate. All right, so that's one purpose. But the other purpose is also that I got to understand them as a person, and I got to know things about their lives and their values that would later help me in doing outreach. So, for example, I might learn things like, well, they have a dog whose name is Teddy, and they love Teddy, and Teddy is like their son. And if I learn this through the conversation later on, when I'm doing animal rights outreach with them, I can ask them, do you think there's a difference between any animal that we exploit and kill for food and Teddy? Do you think they feel pain any differently? And it can make a very powerful moment for them. And the only reason I was able to do that is because I listened and I remembered this information so that I could bring it up later. So in those Uber rides, that's what would happen. We would just talk for 15, 20 minutes. They would talk to B. And then at some point, this inevitably happens almost always. They're like, so what do you do? Like, what are you doing here? Where are you going? And this is when I would go into it. So I would say, oh, I'm here to visit my friends who run an animal sanctuary. They used to be a cattle ranch and now they're vegan. That's crazy. They're like animal rights activists now. Like, I can't believe it. And they'll be like, wow, that's really interesting. And I'd be like, have you ever thought about that? And they'd be like, I guess, I don't know, sometimes, blah, blah, blah. And then the way that I would go about it in those situations, oftentimes, and this worked really well for me, so I'll go on a quick tangent, is I would start by asking them something like, because this was in the States, right? So you can use context to figure out what works in your area. But because in the States, people are just appalled at people who eat dogs, right? So I would ask a question like, have you ever heard about, like, because I'll be like, oh, I'm an animal rights activist. They go, what kind of work do you do? And I would say, well, have you ever heard about the Yulin Dog Meat Festival? Oh, what's that? So I describe the festival. What do you think about it? I think that's horrible. They shouldn't do that. That's awful. I'm like, yeah, a question that's I think is very interesting is, do you think there's a difference between what they do to dogs in Yulin and what we do to chickens, cows, pigs, turkeys, goats, fish in this country? Is there a difference? And that's how it would enter the conversation. And what I found is that people, when I've taken the time to really listen to them, get to know them, and care about what they're saying, because I'm not doing this as a gimmick. I'm not doing this because, well, if I let you talk, then you're going to let me talk. I try to silence my mind and listen and be there with that person and care about them for the time that they're talking to me. Well, if I do that in a genuine way, then what happens is that now when we're having a conversation about animal rights and I'm asking them these really tough questions that a lot of people don't want to answer straight off the bat, like, is there a difference between those animals? Do you think that any animal is okay with what we do to them? If we think about it from their perspective, well, they're actually open to talking about it. And I've walked out of multiple of those cars being like, hey, here's a list of documentaries that I think you should check out. And they're like, I really want to watch these. And of course, I haven't followed up. So I don't know what happened with that. But that has been a lot more effective than any time I've kind of tried to just launch into a conversation about animal rights just because that's what I want to do. And then the person just doesn't seem to want to listen. They seem to tune it out. And of course, you never know what effect you're going to have no matter how you approach it. But to me, what I found is that especially if you have time to spend with someone, taking the time to listen to them, to care about them first, has been extremely helpful. And the more you do that, the better rapport you build too, the less you have to worry about how you actually talk to them about animal rights. In theory, if you have such a good relationship with someone, you can be like, hey, I really want you to listen to this. And then you can go on your 10-minute rants about animal rights and they'll listen to you because you've built that rapport. Not always, but that can also happen. So to get back to that, the Uber driver story, that's what I want to tell you. The third thing that I want to talk to you about today is why over how. So when we make decisions, what psychologists have found is that we are much more compelled to take an action if we know why we're doing it rather than how to do it. So the very simple way that you can think about this is if you are vegan, then think about when you became vegan, what compelled you to become vegan? Was it knowing why you wanted to be vegan, or was it knowing how to be vegan? Like, if you knew why you wanted to be vegan and the why was super strong, but you had no idea how, you would probably go figure out how to do it. But if someone just told you how to do it, but never explained to you why you should do it, then you probably wouldn't do it because, like, quite literally, why would you do it? So what I found is that I found it very useful and effective to focus first and foremost on why people should care about this issue of animal rights, why they might want to change to be vegan, why they might want to be an ally to the animals, why they might want to speak up for animal rights. I've always found it to be much more effective to focus on that than to focus on the how to do it. So even when, and this is especially useful, I found in the streets. See, when I'm talking to someone and we've spoken for like 20 seconds, and all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, I see what you're doing. You vegans are out here, you're doing this thing. But being vegan is expensive. I don't think I could do it. It's too expensive. Well, in that moment, instinctively, you might think to yourself, well, I should tell them about how being vegan is not expensive and how you can actually eat really cheap foods. Have you ever heard of pasta or potatoes or beans or rice? Have you ever heard about those foods? Like, you want to do that. The problem is that's focusing on the how. That person, they probably said that out of just being reactionary or something. They just reacted in the moment. They don't really want to be vegan in the first place. They just thought, yeah, it seems expensive to me, because in their minds, being vegan equates to eating, burgers all day or something like that. And so if you explain that to them, they might be like, okay, I guess that's interesting, but it's not really going to have an effect on them unless they already know why they want to be vegan. And if you haven't established that with them, then most likely they're just not going to be there. And so even if you explain to them super in detail how they can be vegan without spending a lot of money, it's not going to help them in changing their minds and in changing the way that they live, because they don't know why they should do that. So I wrote down a question here that I think is one of the most important questions that you can ask people when you're talking to them about animal rights or veganism. So I guess in theory, I like to talk more about animal rights and the topic of animal rights rather than the idea of being vegan. But I know that for me, a lot of times, and for a lot of people, these topics often gets brought up through the lens of veganism, right? Like, you talk to people and they make a comment about how you're a vegan or something like that. Well, I found this question to be extremely useful whenever I'm about to have a conversation about veganism. So, do you know why vegans are vegan? And the way that I ask this is when someone says something, right? Maybe I'm out to dinner with some people that I've never seen before in my life, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I heard you're vegan, but I mean, don't you think that's kind of weird? How if we were all vegan, animals would overpopulate the planet?" Well, if they say something like that, I'm not going to address that right off the bat. What I'm going to say is something along the lines of, "That's an interesting point you bring up. I would love to talk about that. But before we get into that, I just want to make sure that we're on the same page so that we know we're talking about the same thing. Do you know why vegans are vegan?" And typically people will say, "Yeah, I think it's because of this." And what you'll notice is that people often say something that makes it about you. So they'll say something like, "Vegans are vegan because you think that killing animals is wrong. You think we treat animals horribly, blah, blah, blah. You think this, you think that." And what I will say is, well, I do think that as a vegan, but that's actually not why I'm vegan. And usually people are a little surprised. They're like, "Oh, okay, so tell me why then." I'll ask them, "Do you want to know why?" If they say yes, I'd be like, "We are vegan because we put ourselves in the animal's perspective, and we look at the world through the perspective of the victim in the situation." If we thought about, is it wrong to bully a kid in school? We don't think about it from the perspective of the bullies or anyone who's an outsider. We think about it from the perspective of the kid who's getting bullied. And if they suffer, then we try to stop it because that kid suffers. So we think about it from the animal's perspective. We don't ask ourselves, what do I think about killing a cow for a burger? We think, how does a cow feel about being killed for a burger? That's how we think about it. And I try to clarify that as much as possible. And then moving forward, I always focus the conversation on the why, which is the animal's perspective. And clarifying that upfront at the beginning, for me, has helped so much, because if I don't do that, what tends to happen is that we get lost in this maze of tangents and arguments and all these frankly kind of irrelevant topics and tangents that are confusing to both of us. And most likely what's going to happen is that when you walk away from that conversation, that person is kind of going to be like, okay, I had an argument, but they're not going to remember any main points. Like, you know how when you go to a presentation like this one, after this, and we're going to do a breakout session about this at the end where you talk about what you've learned and what you will, how you want to implement what you've learned in your life. But most likely, if you just think about it off the top of your head, maybe you remember one or two things that were said, something like that. So when you have an argument with someone, they're going to remember maybe one or two things at most, maybe not even. And so to me, I like to try to be very intentional about one point that I make over and over and over again. So I clarify upfront, this is about the animal's perspective. And then I will keep coming back to that. They'll say, but what about this? And I'm like, well, what do you think that would look like from the animal's perspective? And I'm just really persistent on that because I'm like, this is what I want you to remember. This is what I believe to be important as an animal rights activist, is that we see the world through the eyes of the victim, and we actually do what's really in their best interest and not what makes us feel the best. So I'm just going to harp on this point over and over and over and over again. And hopefully walking away, my goal is that they walk away thinking, okay, maybe I should think about the world from the animal's perspective. Or maybe they're like, well, okay, I guess what's important to vegans is the animal's perspective. Something along those lines. That's my goal when I talk to people. I always focus on that why. I clarify it up front, and then I always come back to it again and again and again and again. And that to me has made conversations so simple because in my mind, essentially, that's kind of all I'm thinking when I'm talking to someone about this is how can I communicate the animal's perspective? How can I have that person try to be empathetic to what the animals are going through from their perspective and not talking about what do I think about this? What are our opinions about this? The more I can try to focus the conversation on that, the more effective I find them to be. So that comes pretty much at the end of the 3 points that I wanted to make, which is the last one I just made is focus on the why, the animal's perspective. The one before that was listening. And the first one was, I can't even remember what the first one was. I should know oh yeah, use psychology, not philosophy. I just hit a blank there. It's probably my brain stopped functioning because I'm vegan. So excuse me. I'm probably missing some nutrients. But yeah, that's about it. So if we have time, I wanted to do a quick 5-minute breakout where we put you maybe in groups of 5 and you just talk amongst yourselves and maybe you give yourselves about a minute each to share one takeaway that you took from this workshop and one thing that you will do the next time you talk to someone about animal rights or veganism. And after that, we can do Q&A.
Hello, everybody. Okay, so what we discussed was more of us, all of us in the group resonating with what the speaker spoke to us, and more on, especially in the India context, what we get is a lot of pushback when it comes to especially veganism, or if there's a talk about kindness. So when we talk kindness, it's not really taken well. And when we talk veganism also, there's a pushback. So we were basically, all of us were kind of resonating with the territorial, background to India, where people think kindness is a weakness, and that people who go vegan are also weak. That's something that we discussed. And then we also said that asking questions is much better than imposing something on somebody, because veganism is a choice. It cannot be imposed on anybody. So maybe talk to them, make them themselves answer questions in their own head, and think about what makes it better for them or better for the planet, kind of a thing. So that's what we pretty much discussed. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for sharing that.
Hi, thank you. I think in our group it was a very resounding answer to listening to the animals' perspectives. Was very powerful for us. Before, I think about the animals' perspectives, but I'd never considered sharing that with others. So I think it takes a focus off them and it takes a focus off me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate, for sharing that. I have time for one more person, and I think George Jacobs has volunteered. Thank you, George.
People talked about how why is very important, how too often we focus on how, and we should move more toward the why.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yes, I do agree. I think everyone in the room agreed that that was a very good point Ryuji mentioned. Thank you. Okay, so sorry, we have to move on to Q&A session now. Okay, so if you have any questions, please pop them up in the chat function and we will go through as many of them as possible. So while we're waiting for questions to come in, some comments from me personally. Ryuji, that was a very, very informative talk. Thank you so much. It was very encouraging for you to say that no one's not good at communication and everyone needs learning to be better at communication. And it's so encouraging to hear that from you because, you know, you have very engaging advocacy outreach skills. And to know that you coming from a very anxious, nervous background, it was very encouraging to know that as well. And listening is important. It's a very important message for a lot of vegans, including myself. I have one question for you, Ryuji, if I may.
Sure.
So I know that you have stayed in a few different countries in the past few years. So I was just wondering if there was any cultural differences that you have faced in terms of communication, that you had to adopt strategies depending on the culture, or what you talked about today. Do you think that's quite universal in terms of culture?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think that overall there are like obviously there are cultural differences between different places, but how has that affected my outreach? I think not too much, because what I try to focus on when doing outreach is I try to focus on understanding like the psychological aspects of humans that are universal throughout different cultures. So, for example, at least this is my understanding after doing my best to amateurly study psychology and communication, things like that. You know, listening in order to be heard is just something that's inherently human. Like people appreciate being listened to wherever you are. And I think that there are certain psychological, I wouldn't call them triggers, but there are certain psychological aspects to the way that we work as humans that are universal throughout different places. So those, I found that, you know, I always use the same ones. But then I guess what I would change is maybe change the context of what I say. So for example, if I was in a place where eating dogs was normal, I wouldn't start by asking someone, well, what do you think about people who eat dogs? Because they'd be like, well, I think that's normal. That's something that I say very specifically in places where people just really hate people who eat dogs. Like in the States, for example, I've done that a lot. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Ryuji. I have a few questions from our audience. Okay, so from Amruta, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. From Amruta, what do you think would be the best way to answer someone who says that people are more important than animals? Ryuji.
Yeah, so it's the same way that I would answer most questions that people have, is bring it back to the animal's perspective. So when we talk about this question, who's more important, animals or humans? When someone is asking you that question, they're thinking about it from their perspective. They're not saying who's inherently more important. They're asking, or they're saying, what they're trying to say is, to me, humans are more important than animals. To me, that's what they're saying. And what I would try to do is shift the conversation to, we can talk about this all day and we might have differing opinions, but do you think that an animal values their life any less than we value our own life? And that is the question that I would attempt to ask. It's not always going to go well, and people are going to say, well, animals are stupid. They're going to, you know, they're going to say what they're going to say. But that is where I would shift the conversation, because if you talk about my opinion versus your opinion, it's very hard to conclude that, because the other person can just think in their minds, well, this is my opinion, and that's it. And end of conversation. There's nothing to say. It's kind of like if someone says, well, I prefer the color blue to the color pink. Okay, well, you're not going to convince them that pink is better than blue. So that's kind of the end of the conversation. So if they think, well, I think that humans are more important than animals, that's kind of it. But if you go the route of, well, we're all animals. We have all come to this place in time through this process, this biological process called evolution. And evolution has implanted in all of us emotions such as fear or the ability to suffer so that we can survive and reproduce. Those are things that we all have as animals and sentient beings. It's not exclusive to humans. So that being the case, do animals themselves value their lives any less than we value our lives? That's and this is for almost anything that people throw out there. This is always what I try to bring it back to. But in this situation, that's definitely where I would try to go.
Thank you so much for that, Ryuji. Okay, jumping on to the next question. It popped up earlier in the talk from Nadia from Japan. She says, I find it difficult when people close the conversation by saying humans have always eaten animals. And Eunicia from Philippines have agreed. Yes, that's what they usually say, or that we need to eat meat to survive. What would you say to these statements, Ryuji?
Yeah, so again, to me, like I always go back to the same thing. So basically, if someone says, well, we've always eaten other animals, I'd be like, okay, well, let's talk about a real situation that happens today. Do you think that when today in 2020, we kill a cow to eat a burger, do you think that cow is okay with that? And I try to bring it back to that ethical question. Of course, you can ask a question to kind of preamble that and start by asking a question such as, okay, that's a good point. That is true. You can acknowledge what people say is true. If someone says, well, we've always eaten animals, well, is it completely true? I'm not sure, but you can say, that's a good point. First of all, is it because we've always done something that it makes it okay today? And you can try to find examples for that. As humans, we evolve, so you can go there. But what I would do, at least with the way that I handle it, is I ask that question first, and then I go into, well, let's look at it from the animal's perspective. And I don't know, that's just always where I bring it back to. So that's still where I bring it back in that situation.
Thank you so much, Ryuji. Okay, next question from Monica. What to do when people just don't have compassion for the animals, Ryuji? Yeah,
so I think with everything that I've said, right, it's very easy for me to kind of sit here and be like, well, this is what you should do. This is how you talk to people. But at the end of the day, when you talk to someone, the conversation is always dynamic and you don't always know where it's going to go. And ultimately, one thing that I try to do is I always think about my success in a conversation in terms of what I have done. So to me, for example, the things that I've talked about today, if I listen, if I try to understand that person psychologically, not philosophically, if I actually talk about the animal's perspective and I ask them tough questions about that, to me, that's a success because I can't do any more than what I know what to do. So if someone doesn't have compassion for animals, that's something that's outside my control. I can't control that. And maybe I'll talk to them the same way that I'll talk to anyone else, and they're just not going to care. I can't control that. And so to me, what I do at least is there's two this answer is a two-parted answer, because on one hand is, well, what do you say? What do you do in that situation when you're in front of that person? And then there's the question of how do you emotionally deal with that? Because it can be very discouraging. So I think those are two separate things to talk about. The first thing, what do you do? To me, no matter who I'm talking to, I always try to approach it the same way. I just try to be like as empathetic as possible, build as much rapport with the person as possible, and then talk about the animal's perspective and try to put them in the animal's perspective. That is always what I do. If they have no compassion for animals, I don't think you don't care about animals, and that's okay. I care about animals surely more than you do. That's clear. Even if you don't care about animals, do you think that the animal's perspective matters, even if you don't care about them? And if that perspective matters, what do you think it's like? Do you think they're okay with what we do to them? It's the same thing. I will always do the same thing, But even when I do that, sometimes people just don't care. Sometimes people just don't want to hear it. And in that case, well, okay, I've done everything I can do. So that's what I physically do. That's what I say. That's where I lead the conversation. But then if it doesn't work well, how do I deal with it emotionally? To me, the first thing is, like I said in the presentation, I think about it as a learning experience. I'm going to think to myself, what can I learn from this? And then also, one shift in my mindset has really helped me is that I don't believe that the outcome of any one conversation is going to shift the course of history. So in the past, when I'll be really discouraged, it's because I would think to myself, well, if I can't convince this person to change, then the world is never going to change. It's always going to be like this. There's so many people like this. But the way that I understand the world now is when social change happens, it is like the world is not going to become an animal friendly place because every single person on the face of the earth is like, you know what, I'm going to be vegan now. It's more so there's a minority of people, which is us, at some point are going to do something in order to force change upon the system, and then things are going to change. Or at least that's how social changes happened in the past. So thinking about it logically, to me, I think that's the most probable way it's going to happen in this movement as well. And that being the case, whether or not one person wants to be unreceptive to the conversation I have with them, in my mind, it's clear that, okay, well, that's not going to change how history is going to turn out in the long run. And thinking about it like that has helped me not be very discouraged about that one conversation. And instead, what I try to do is just forget about that one and focus my energy on talking to people who are actually receptive to change, to taking action, and to being an ally to the animals. So I hope that answers that question, but that's how I deal with someone who seemingly has no compassion for animals.
Thank you so much, Ryuji. There are a few more questions from Winda. How do you communicate with family who's not really into veganism or animal rights? I sometimes find it even more difficult talking to my own family rather than friends or strangers. Have you experienced this before?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it's definitely been a lot harder for me to talk to my family, even my close friends. I find it much easier to talk to strangers than I do, like, at least emotionally. What I found is multiple things. First of all, the more I practice the skill of outreach with strangers, the easier I found it to do it with family. So this one time I went back to see my family in Singapore, but previously I had spent a lot of time doing outreach. Like every week I would go out and talk to people on the streets. And what I found is that the last time I've been to Singapore, it was a total disaster. It was so bad me talking about animal rights to my family over there. But this time, what I did is I was like, okay, it's emotionally more difficult to do it, but the principles are, I'm going to apply the same principles. So when I was talking to my family, they'll be like, well, you think this. And I would be like, well, I do think this, but ultimately what I think is important is the animal's perspective. And basically, I would just do the same thing that I did with a stranger. The only difference was it was more emotionally difficult, but because I had a lot of practice, it's like, when you learn to ride a bicycle and maybe in certain situations it's harder to ride a bicycle, like maybe when you go up a hill or something, well, you can kind of think about it like that. If you'd never practiced riding a bicycle, it's going to be hard for you to bike up that hill. So talk to your friends and family. But if you practice riding a bicycle, then it's still harder, but you can do it. And it's the same skills. So to me, my friends and family, I try to approach them the same way. And what's helped with that is practicing outside of that. But the flip side of that coin is what I said in the previous question as well, where in my opinion, you have to recognize that not everyone is going to be affected by you. In the same way that you're not meant to be friends with everyone, not everyone is going to be affected by you or changed by you. You can't change the world on your own. Some people, they're just not going to listen to you, whatever the situation is. And if it's someone on the streets that really doesn't want to listen to you, well, it's kind of easy to let go of that because you're never going to see them again. And emotionally, it's harder to let go of that if they're your friends and family. But I still think the same thing applies, where if you have a family member or a close friend who's so determined to not be vegan, no matter what, they just don't want to have it. And you know what? They're going to argue with you till the very bitter end. They're just not having it. Well, I would say let it go because maybe it's not meant to be. And instead of focusing all your energy on that one person, focus your energy on people who are receptive, who are maybe not your family members, or whatever. I think that's a much more productive way to go. And I think that sometimes, especially if you're not very active outside of, say, talking to your friends and family, it's very discouraging because to you, the 3 to 5 people who are in your close circle, they feel like the entire world. So if you can't convince those 3 or 5 people to change, you're like, well, I must be really bad at this. This is horrible. The world is horrible. But instead, if you're like, okay, they're just 3 to 5 people in the entire world. I'm going to forget about them, even though they're my friends and family. Like, I'm going to stop wasting my time and energy on them. I'm going to go communicate with all these other people who are open to these ideas. Then you have a much greater chance of creating a much bigger impact in the world. So that's really how I would approach it. On one hand, do the same thing as you would, and practicing with strangers and practicing in your life in general is going to make it easier with your friends and family. But then if they're not the type to be receptive to you, and just let it go, because you can't do anything about it at the end of the day.
Thank you so much, Ryuji. I think we have time for one more question. So I'm going to go for this one. Yes, there are actually two similar question from two people. So how do you start initiating animal advocacy in a conservative society where the belief in animal sentience in general is considered outlandish? And another one from Aileen. In Muslim countries, there's a sacrifice feast. Millions of animals get killed yearly. When someone states that they're against that, people take it as if you're disrespecting their religion. So I don't know exactly how to go around that without offending people. I know you probably haven't lived in a country where a majority of people are Muslim people, but if you have any answers, a universal solution to this, that would be great, Ryuji.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very difficult situation for sure. And like Ellie said, I don't have personal experience with this. So like, I'm not sure how useful my answer is going to be, but I think that if I were in this situation, and this is purely hypothetical, right? So out of all the answers I gave today, this is the one that you should probably pay attention to the least. But the way that I would try to go about it is I would try to find, like, I would do my very best. Okay, I guess 2 parts to this. First of all, I would be okay try to be okay emotionally with offending some people sometimes. We all offend people sometimes. Like, I've offended a lot of people. And maybe it's not as bad as what you might face. Make sure that you're safe. So, I've never been in a position where I can offend someone and I'm unsafe. So I don't know, maybe that might be a position you're in. I don't know. So that's one. But the other is I would try as best I can to find within that community of people who are conservative or people who are just don't even believe in animal sentience. I don't know how you would do this, but what I would strive for is finding the other community members who are going to be open-minded. If you are a part of that community and you were open-minded to change, somehow I'm guessing that you grew up in a community that is maybe super not like the way that you think right now. Well, you yourself, you broke out of that. And if that's the case, it might be a minority of people, but there will be also other people who will also vibe with you and who will think the same way as you. I don't know how you find those people, but my best advice would be to, instead of trying to initiate the conversation with everyone and putting yourself in a position where everyone's going to attack you, try to find those people who will be on your side and then create a very strong community with them. Community in our movements, I feel is so important. And if you look at how social movements have worked in the past, having tight-knit communities has been one of the most important factors that has led to actual change. And so, you're not going to change everyone overnight. But I think that if you try to find those people that you can be close friends with, that you can actually form a community with and kind of spread out from there, that's how I would approach it. But again, like I said, I don't personally have experience with that. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that is at least how I would think about it in theory.
Thank you so much, Ryuji, for sharing that. I think that's it. We don't have enough time to go through all of the questions. Sorry about that. But thank you so much for those of you who have submitted questions. And yep, that comes to the end of our workshop. Thank you so much again, Ryuji, for doing this talk. It was a very informative and important talk. I know as vegans, we probably, all of us, go through difficult communications, no matter where we're based. So that was a very, very useful workshop. Thank you so much.